we've heard a lot of talk about Texas. We are in Texas, and the Texas energy market. So up next, that's exactly what our fireside chat is going to be about, the future of energy in Texas. And to talk about that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Senior Director of Content and Research, Chris Moyer, and Bill Magness at ERCOT. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. And Bill drove down from Austin during lunch. He was in front of the State Public Utility Commission this morning, giving a report, a glowing report. It's been hot out there, Bill. Tell me a little bit about what's going on at ERCOT right now. You having a good summer?
Yeah, first, I really appreciate you not having a fire for the fireside chat. That's very wise.
Yep.
Again, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here today. And yes, we have had an interesting summer. I think if you look back 2 years ago, really, but if you look back to this spring when we were issuing our outlooks for the summer, we were anticipating that if we saw record loads, which we anticipated we'd see, and we have, and various conditions on the grid because of the tight supply situation, we could have an energy emergency alert situations. And then summer came, and if you live in Texas, you remember how frigid it was in June. So cold, so cold. It was actually the coolest, wettest, been the wettest June in years. The coolest June we've had in Texas since 2007. So it's all relative if you're not from Texas, but we did have a pretty cool June. Then July, it sort of dried out and was still relatively mild temperatures for Texas. But then August, as we saw the drying, just as August rolled in, we saw a whole lot of heat. So these last, few weeks, really beginning about August 5th, the week of the 5th, the week of the 12th, we started to see demand increase. We're getting over 70,000 megawatts on the system, which our record as of last year was 73 and some. We began to see the pricing impact of that as the supplies became more and more scarce. We're starting to see prices like August 5th, $2,500 with all the adders in, and bouncing around as we went into those scarcity conditions. Then on the week of the 12th, we set a new record, over 74,000 megawatts, 531, I think. On Monday the 12th, Tuesday the 12th, a little lower. But on Tuesday the 12th, the conditions on wind and outages were different. So we saw an energy emergency alert. And for ERCOT, that just means we deploy our emergency response service, basically our demand response service. And we deploy resources that are set for that. There's still additional resources we hold in reserve for deeper emergencies. But went into that on the 13th, came back out, and then had to go back in on the 15th. With another EEA1, but again, it didn't have to go into the deeper levels of emergency service. Certainly didn't see rotating outages, so no disruption to the overall system. We did see, as anticipated, the prices go to our cap of $9,000 a megawatt hour, and that when we get into the energy emergency alert situation, it's basically administratively capped, so you just have $9,000 megawatt hour prices for the period of the energy emergency alert. So on the 13th of August, that was roughly 3:15 p.m. to around 5. Just about the same thing on Thursday, the 15th. So some very significant pricing events on the system, but that's how the scarcity market and the energy-only market's designed, that when you have those kind of conditions, that's what you expect. One other thing I'll mention that's been interesting this summer is we're really starting to see a divergence between the peak time and the time of the lowest reserves on the system. Traditionally you think as the load is climbing up toward its peak for the day, somewhere 4 or 5 p.m. in our system, that's when you're going to see the most scarcity. Well, what's really driving scarcity now is our net load. There tends to be a pretty strong wind coming out of the west, and the north of Texas up until around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then it takes a dive, and then it works its way back up as from the coast of Texas. So that geographic diversity serves us in the summer. And the days that we've been tightest have not necessarily been our highest load days when we set those records, but days when the wind was low or we've had higher forced outage rates than normal. But that's why you see us declaring these emergencies at 3 p.m. And then by around 5, we're in better shape. So that, I think, to the point of this conference, I mean, certainly informs what kind of opportunities there are out there around solar, around storage going forward, when you're looking at those net load periods that could also be high pricing periods as well as low reserve periods.
Well, I know it's not a record that you necessarily want to be breaking on a consistent basis, but congratulations on your record-breaking.
It's a little nerve-wracking, but
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think that's a nice transition. You mentioned that that with these types of events happening on a more frequent basis, there's going to be some opportunity for solar and storage to help alleviate that, to help address some of those issues when it comes to offsetting peak. Can you talk to me and talk to us a little bit about what are some of those things that have been driving solar and storage in the ERCOT market over the last few years, and we'll kind of explore from there.
Okay. Well, I can't imagine I'm the first person to point this out in this conference, but the price of solar is coming down very substantially. The larger impact in the ERCOT market so far has been utility scale. We don't have the kind of rooftop penetration that like California has seen, although that's shifting. I mean, we're seeing more rooftop in the Texas market on the distribution side than we have over the last several years. There's an increasing amount of distributed energy resources, whether solar, thermal, whatever, and rooftop is getting to be a bigger and bigger portion of that. So that, cost issue is certainly big. Second, here, well, there's a lot of sun here, and some of the best irradiance is far west. And while we're still we utilities, everybody involved is sort of feverishly building transmission out into the Delaware Basin and the Permian and trying to get more of that built, there is opportunities out there for the good solar resources to be connected to transmission in a way in ERCOT, which may not be true everywhere. And then as far as storage goes, we're seeing some of as I'm sure y'all are aware, seeing solar developments linked with storage, and as well as storage being added to a wind farm. I know, actually happened to be out in Roscoe, Texas, and saw the installation on a day when I was visiting a wind farm. Actually got to see that, which is kind of cool for me. But so we're beginning to see it. But the most interesting piece from our perspective, kind of from a macro grid perspective, is if you are generating a whole lot of very cheap, maybe negatively priced wind, and that can be charging batteries, and those batteries can be discharged during times of scarcity or higher prices. That's an opportunity. When you have ramping like we see of several thousand megawatts in very rapid order, when the wind's coming up or down, or when the sun's coming down or up, again, that's that same opportunity, and we certainly have a lot of that, and more of it as our load grows on the system.
Going back to that transmission piece, particularly around solar, do you see that's what are some of those opportunities for increased transmission opportunities, bringing more solar into the transmission grid over the next couple of years, for next 2 to 5 years in Texas?
Well, there's a lot of transmission being built into places that, when you look at the irradiance maps of Texas, are good solar areas. Now, specific sites I couldn't speak to, but the transmission that is being built, justified primarily by load growth in the Permian and in far west Texas, which is very much driven by oil and gas exploration, which continues to grow and redouble. that transmission may be not just useful for the oil and gas industry and the load that they're generating, but as the highway that, can connect out to additional solar. And as more distribution side, but larger solar projects are being built, I mean, that's just as critical, that you have that need to be able to connect into the transmission system off that distribution system. Now, in a lot of the far West Texas, you're really building out the distribution system for the first time at the level that we're talking about, because a lot of those places that are now in the middle of an industrial boom were at the end of the line of small radial lines for generations, and now we're having to have 345 backbones running through them. So I think that overall development, it's kind of one of those tides that might lift a lot of boats in the end. But I think that's one of the main places we're seeing it.
I do think that that's such a unique and interesting part of what is driving solar in Texas and storage. It's counterintuitive to what you might see in California or in other markets. It's that demand for energy at the oil and gas fields. It's that demand for energy in more remote areas that is somewhat counterintuitive, because more often than not, people think of solar as this is the green solution, but it's actually helping to just continue to feed a booming Texas economy.
Yeah, really, in my simple mind, everything's either load or generation most of the time, not all the time. And out there, oil and gas is load. That's what's justifying the latest transmission build into far West Texas that's load that's got to be served. And in the meantime, it's providing opportunities for new types of generation that weren't there before. So, yeah, it's an interesting set of opportunities that are showing up for various reasons. But just to put it in context, the CREZ build out, the competitive renewable energy zones, we saw the large build of transmission primarily to bring wind from the west to the east in Texas. That was about a $7 billion program when it was all said and done. We energized $1 billion of transmission last year in ERCOT. Another roughly $4 billion is underway right now, with a lot more on the drawing board. So you're seeing just enormous continued investment to move that power.
We've got a really wonderful, varied audience right here, and one of the things that we've been talking about over the last day and a half is the points of integration. And there are a lot of stakeholders that are interested in solar and storage in Texas and beyond. But how do we bring those various stakeholders together, the utilities, the developers, regulators, policymakers, to make sure that as we're bringing more solar and storage onto the grid, that it's done in a smooth and mindful way?
Have I got a stakeholder process for you? That's underway at ERCOT. I'm not, I couldn't tell you that we are where I think we ought to be as far as all of the rules, because storage is the kind of thing that, at the highest level, blows one's simple mind, because it is load and generation, right? And so just the fundamental, how do I model this? How do I put this in the technology systems that are needed to run, secure, dispatch, and settle our grid? How do I get that stuff in? Right now, storage in the ERCOT models is controllable load and generation. It's two things, and that doesn't make a lot of sense for the long term. And I think that's emblematic to me of how you do it the right way versus how you maybe not do it the right way. Is don't decide you're going to do it the janky one-off way forever. Take the time to figure out how to build the models in the proper way. Take the time to think through the issues around all of those things I mentioned. How do we dispatch this? What about a resource that is ready to be dispatched as generation but can only be available for 4 hours and wants to be dispatched at a time of higher economic opportunity? What do I do with that in my sked? When I'm used to saying, you go now. It's different, right? So we're looking at, in the ERCOT stakeholder process, at a range of issues. We had a meeting of our technical advisory committee, our sort of main stakeholder body right under our board of directors, in May where a lot of assignments got made. And they got made to reliability and operations subcommittees. They got made to wholesale market subcommittees. And so there's a lot of work going on, and it's a lot of work to be involved in it, I grant you. But that's what we're really trying to push through this year and next year, because we're in the process of a lot of market and grid change that are tied up in the Public Utility Commission's decision that we should do real-time co-optimization on our system. Probably the largest market and software change we've made since our nodal market opened in 2010. We'll be undertaking that now through 2024 is the schedule. Sort of simultaneously, it's also time for us to upgrade our energy management system, which is, if you work in our business, sort of is the brains of an electric system. And we got to work the real-time co-optimization into that. And I think thinking about getting those storage rules established to the point that we can put those into the flow as well, and know that we've got a very modern, very appropriate way of integrating these resources for the long term is something we'll be paying a lot of attention to. Now, as far as how to do it smoothly, I mean, our stakeholder process works, but it's not always smooth. But we tend to get answers, right? And I think from ERCOT's perspective, we're at the point now where we need answers because the resource is showing up. And I think one thing that we do, and I would like us to see continue to do as well as anybody in the world, is integrate new resource types. It's not always pretty, and it's not always easy, and it's not always perfect, and it constantly evolves. But what we've done with wind and what we're now doing with utility scale solar is as advanced as you're seeing anywhere in the world with the integration of those things into a market structure. And we're going to have to do the same thing with storage because the market's demanding it. It's showing up. So that's why we feel like we got to put a little bit more of a push on it. But that's where the work's going to go on.
Slightly shifting gears, utility scale power purchase agreements have really been driving solar to this point, as you mentioned in Texas. But over the next few years, corporate PPAs are going to become a greater and greater part of that energy mix, carbon offsets. How will that ultimately impact the expansion of solar and storage within the state?
It seems like it could have a big impact. I mean, this isn't ERCOT data, but I read recently that I guess so far in 2019, like 40% of the PPAs that are around sustainability targets are resources in Texas, or resources in ERCOT, actually. And why is that? Well, it's the sun and the wind. You can't just go get sun and wind anywhere, right? So we're sort of uniquely positioned for a lot of people who want to bring those resources on to get their credits or make their PPA agreements for resources in ERCOT. Now, it's a different kind of, I was talking to some folks earlier about it, I kind of in my mind call this aspirational generation. It's generation that is not, I'm not building this generation because I have this much load to serve. I'm not necessarily building this generation because I see a market opportunity in the energy-only, real-time or day-ahead market. I'm building it for other purposes, but it's going to need to integrate into that market. So it seems like a relatively new kind of opportunity for people to invest here that we haven't seen before. The motivations are different, but I think the outcome ends up being relatively the same as what we've seen in the past. There's new resources. They need to be connected by transmission. They need to be integrated into market systems just as all our other resources are. So yeah, I think it certainly provides some interesting opportunities that come from an angle that we really haven't seen as much of in the past.
And I mean, could that ultimately be driving, sending some of these resources out of state then as well? Or is that a little bit beyond kind of some of the calculations that you do? You
mean the sustainability targets?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I can't speak to what exactly people are looking for because I don't participate in those contracts. Sure. But I think a lot of what we've seen is kind of where I started. If you have to be in a place where those kind of resources are available, and if what you're looking for is solar, large scale, utility type scale solar, and the transmission system to send it back to where the people live, there's only so many places you can go to do that, but Texas certainly isn't the only one. I mean, there's a lot of a lot of sunshine, other places. So.
Good sunshine here, though, in Texas.
Oh, there's excellent sunshine. Yeah. It's persistent, intense sunshine. Yeah.
I walked outside for just a minute, and I can feel it. So.
Oh, it's out there, yeah. No, it's very good.
As we kind of touch on some of those other markets, ERCOT's been at the forefront for a variety of reasons, deregulation being one of them, but how you approach transmission, how you approach the incorporation of wind. So what can other markets learn from ERCOT when it comes to the integration of renewables, wind, solar storage?
I'd say number one is learn how to forecast. The importance of very good multi-sourced wind and solar forecasting cannot be overestimated. I mean, you used to forecast load. We still forecast load. You forecasted load, you didn't forecast generation. Well, now we're forecasting load and generation on the same system. And it's equally important to know what you're going to be seeing. And it's gotten, at least when we have more experience with solar, we have solar forecasting now, and we're working to continue to beef that up. The wind forecasting has gotten amazingly good. I mean, the resources out there to do that very, very well. So that's one. I think probably the most important thing is to really invest effectively in those resources. Because if you get caught out because of a bad forecast, it's just always a bad day. Second thing is the rules. I mean, I grew up as a lawyer, so I'm biased. But I think, again, these stakeholder processes here and elsewhere where you come up with the rule set, you're going to have to work through objections from various entities who have different interests than yours. And getting through that and thinking, carefully about the technology and what's really doable, what can work in the IT systems, all that stuff is hard. It's can be drudgery, and we have something at ERCOT called the Resource Definition Task Force. Now that sounds like a sexy way to spend time, right? But it's so essential because the basic definition of what is storage, what are we going to say storage is, what are we going to designate as solar, et cetera, just really critical. And it particularly as you look at things like more behind the meter, more distributed energy resources, how those are defined and how they interact with the existing rule set for what works on the grid, is going to be really critical. So I'd say I guess those are the sort of the top two I think about as far as the integration practice.
And I'm going to open it up to the audience for some questions here in just a little bit, but as we project out into the future, there's been a pretty rapid ramp over the last few years, predated by wind, of solar and storage in Texas. But as you look out 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what is the state of solar in Texas and in the ERCOT market? And storage, excuse me.
Well, I don't want to cop out, but that's much more for y'all to decide. I mean, whenever we issue like our capacity, demand, and reserves report, we'll give you what our load forecast is, but what we tell you about generation is what developers tell us. It is really a market in that respect. And what developers are telling us is that most of what we're going to see on our system is solar and wind. Now there's, I think as of now, about 52 gigawatts of proposed utility scale solar in our interconnection queue. Now they don't have interconnection agreements, they're not in our CDR, but that's an enormous number of projects. Those projects, unlike building a nuclear plant, they're nimble. I mean, they can be built in a couple years, but they can be delayed a little more easily too, right? So there's a lot of fluidity that I expect we'll see in people's decision making, but at least what developers are telling us they're interested in, it's gas and wind and solar, and we see a whole lot of the solar in the queue at the moment.
Well, let's drill in on that a little bit. We'd been talking earlier, and you had mentioned that something like half of the overall demand of the state is being built with solar. Can you talk a little bit more, in at least proposed projects, there's enough gigawatts of solar that in 5 years, if all of those were to come to fruition, that could potentially meet half of your load?
Well, I don't know about half of load every day, but we had an all-time peak of 74,500 some. And if you had 52,
Right.
if you had that much solar, and solar, utility scale solar in Texas runs on peak, right? I mean, that could change the dynamic of what the load peak looks like dramatically from a reliability perspective, from a pricing perspective. The thing I was talking about at the outset about how the time when you hit the overall load peak is not the time of the biggest scarcity. If you have that much more solar running on peak, that accentuates that because it's going hard, as the current solar does, about 17 to 1,800 megawatts now, runs hard over that time of day. It really could shift the dynamics of a lot of things that we're seeing on the grid and in the markets.
Bringing some of those peak pricing down a little bit, or would we still reach that peak $9,000 for a megawatt hour?
Well, you still could, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, the potential is still there because it may be that you're reaching it at a very different time of day.
Sure.
Right. I mean, you may be reaching it over dinner time.
Right.
I mean, it may be coming. If solar's low, and you're leaning on it for peak, and then the whole duck curve issue we've heard about for years, that it could shift, and or it may look more like winter. You might have a couple of peaks as far as net load goes, not overall load, peak load. So I think as the system shifts, those dynamics change, and we've got to keep up with it. But that's if you think about, well, what did I say was one of the biggest things I spend my time doing every afternoon in the summer is watching the wind go down and then watching it go up and watching the load. Are they chasing each other? How are they doing? Are they getting along? Nobody did that 10 years ago. I mean, that wasn't a thing, right? But now it's one of the key factors in determining where we are every single day. And I think those shifts are going to continue to occur as we have new, different characteristic type generation sources, solar and storage in particular, integrated into the system.
Well, I don't want to just totally monopolize your time with my questions, so I'd like to open it up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions for Bill? We'll start, both of these gentlemen, we'll start with you on the far left.
Mike Sloan, Vertus Energy. That $9,000 megawatt hour seems to catch people's attention and spawn newspaper articles, some of which even called to re-regulate all of ERCOT, right? And I got to say, I got like former PUC commissioner here, you're here, there's a lot of stakeholders, and we're, I think, like 3 days away from the 20-year anniversary of SB7 going into effect. Sort of bristle, I want to react to that, and I'm curious if ERCOT, if you either just know these numbers off the top of your head, or if you actually put something together to compare ERCOT's performance versus either the Eastern and Western Interconnect or individual RTOs on reliability, price, and environmental improvement over that 20 years. Because I have to figure ERCOT's, if it's not at the front of all three of those, it's got to be up there close.
Oh, I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but one, when you look at those criteria, I mean, start with reliability. The EEA1 condition we got into was the first time in 5 years. The last time was a winter event, 2014. We had rotating outages in 2011 in February. Otherwise, I mean, we've been operating, and I got to step back and say, as a grid operator, those maintain reliability, right? Those are that you do that to make sure you have reliability, and we have, since SB7. And on the environmental front, again, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but certainly the emissions reductions we've seen in Texas have been pretty enormous. One, when SB7 first went into effect, you saw a whole lot of older, more inefficient resources go off the grid, replaced by a lot of more efficient, especially gas resources that had better profile on emissions. And then, of course, the wind and the solar that I've spent a lot of time talking about today have changed the picture there. And then on efficiency, I mean, the overall prices have been very low. What last year was, I guess last year we got up higher because we did see some pricing activity in the summer, but it's been $30 for several years, kind of overall LMP in Texas. And even if you have these high price spikes, you still settle back down. For example, and again, it all depends on what's on the grid that day. On Monday of this week, we had our second highest peak ever, over 74,000 megawatts. And I think when we went over peak, even earlier in the afternoon, prices were $30, maybe lower, because the wind was blowing, right? So we're operating at very high efficiency. So I think we are proud to stand up, with our other counterparts in other markets as far as the key metrics go. And on the bristling part, I think, my counterparts in other parts of the world, the PJMs and ISO New England's have always said, well, your market's really cool, but nobody will ever stand for it when the prices go that high. And that's what we're going to find out, right? I mean, we're going to see, because we've had that experience now. And, I was in front of the Public Utility Commission this morning, and their view is this is working as designed. This is how it's got to go for this kind of market to work. Now we'll see, when the bills all come due, how everybody feels. But I think I've seen very strong commitment to this market structure from the legislature, from the PUC, from the folks who, make those decisions. So far so good.
Because it's the rarity. It is that as designed, it's the rarity to have those 9,000.
It's reflective of scarcity. I mean, if you continue to see really tight reserve margins, maybe we hit some point of equilibrium, economic equilibrium, and we've done studies to look at what that is, and that number is a fair amount lower than a kind of a traditional 15% reserve margin. So, yeah, we'll see.
Time for one more question right here.
Oh,
thank you.
Wayne Callender, CPS Energy. I just, you mentioned a little bit about the DERs, right? And, and including, and maybe you don't have any numbers because the 12th and 13th are so fresh. Do you have any idea of, what impact like demand response as well as the DERs had on helping us get through that time period?
Well, there was certainly an impact. And one of the things we're going to be doing over the next month and further than that is look more closely at the demand response data. In fact, the chairman of the commission asked us specifically to give him more data on that. But some of that has to await settlements and all the rest. But that said, I mean, watching the chart, you can see it. I mean, you can see 4CP activity or other kinds of demand response, whether it's people turning on their backup engines or bringing down their load. Either way, and I know at CPS you have a lot of that going on in this area. But you just see, the load's climbing. This around 3 o'clock, it sort of flattens out. It's still hot. People are still running air conditioning, so that's where we definitely see an impact. And I think there's going to be more and more interest in the quantification of that as it gets to be a bigger and bigger piece of what's out on the system. Yeah.
So I lied. We're going to do one quick question in the back.
Thank you. I'm planted here because I admire Mr. Magness and Mr. Moyer. Mine is just a footnote to the question that gentleman asked about the outages and reliability. And you already know the answer. NERC every year issues a report of regional reliability. And usually ERCOT is on the top of the list in terms of an excellent performer, in terms of reliability, quality of service, and so on. The only thing is the number of weather caused, climatological events have gone up. So if you're interested for actual data, that may be a good reference. Pardon me, I had to add a little footnote as a teacher.
Well, thank you, Masood. And actually, on that note, one of my favorite quotes of the year is Jim Robb, who's the CEO of NERC, was giving their summer seasonal assessment to FERC. And Jim said, "There is no way in hell," he said to FERC, that a market like ERCOT can manage reliably with that kind of reserve margin. And yet they do, right? And Jim and I have talked about this, and actually Dan Walker, our PUC chair, and I are going to the NERC board meeting in November to talk about it. I mean, to talk about how do we do this? Because every year NERC says, well, you're below a 15% reference reserve margin, we're worried about you. And we say, thank you for your concern. And then we'd go, I don't mean to be flip about it, but I mean, it's just, it's an interesting question for the industry generally, because as we have a different kind of grid, the traditional measures don't really fit, right? And so there's a lot of thinking that we're doing, and I think NERC wants to be doing as well, about how do we determine, how are we doing in these kind of markets that work differently, both from where the resources are coming from and how the economic incentives work to supply them. And so I think we'll all be learning about that as we go.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
All right.